Mehr als freundlich. Der Podcast zum Williams-Beuren-Syndrom. Mit Professor Ingolf Prosetzky und spannenden Gästen und interessanten Geschichten zum WBS.
Welcome to the podcast Williams-Beuren Syndrome, More Than Friendly. So far, the podcast has only been spoken in German. Since the following talk with my Irish guest Fionnuala Tynan was in English, there are two versions for the first time. The original English version and the second episode with a German translation. So this will happen more often in the future, as I plan to continue inviting international Williams syndrome experts. So if you enjoy this original episode, please feel free to recommend it and subscribe the podcast. In the show notes, you will find information on where you can download the educational guideline for the Williams syndrome. And now, have enjoyment and inspiration while listening. I'm very happy and proud to welcome my Irish guest here in the podcast. She's one of the few Williams syndrome researchers worldwide who is active in the field of applied science and wants to understand how people with Williams syndrome learn best. She is able to communicate complex scientific topics in such a simple and easy way that at the first you don't even understand how relevant and helpful her research is. She has recently developed an educational guide for children with Williams syndrome, which she developed with Jo van Herwegen, but above all with 12 young children with Williams syndrome. This learning book, My Own Williams Learning, has just been translated into German and published. So we will talk about this in detail later. My guest is also a very humorous and fantastic colleague. Welcome to the podcast talk, Dr. Fionnuala Tynan.
Thank you, Ingolf. I'm delighted to have the opportunity to talk to you on your podcasts. I think it's rare for us who are involved in the Williams syndrome community to have people to talk to about this rare condition in a professional way. So I'm delighted to get your invitation and to be here today.
Excellent. I'm sure that families and parents and maybe teachers and school staff would be interested in learning about you and your practice-based research. But before we start talking about something personal and your connection to the syndrome, I'd like you to make a typical noise from your professional activities or perhaps from your private life that comes to mind.
A noise?
A noise?
Okay, I think the noise will be this. I laugh a lot.
Yes. Yes, I would say it's a very, very typical noise for you. Let's start with a few questions about your private life. I think I can imagine that it played a big role in your life, that you have a brother, Jarleth, with Williams syndrome, and
Yes.
He's 9 years younger as you. And could you tell us anything? What was it like for you, for your family back in the 80s in Ireland?
So Jarleth was born in 1983, and we are living in the west of Ireland, a rural part of Ireland. And this baby was born. Now, in Ireland, there are many large families. So there are 5 children in my family, and Jarleth was the youngest. So he has 4 older sisters. So his development was slow. And it was really interesting, the conversations. Some people were saying, well, boys' development is typically slower than girls. And they were saying to my mother when she had concerns, you're used to having girls, boys can be different. Then when the delay seemed to be more pronounced, they said the girls are doing too much for Jarleth. You know, they are impeding his development because they do too much for him. And I remember even at that very young stage, so age 9, 10, feeling a sense of guilt that we could be interfering with his development. I remember taking that very seriously as a 9 and 10-year-old. Then he had a couple of stays in hospital where the phrase is failure to thrive. He wasn't putting on weight, you know, he was much smaller than would be typical for his age. But actually, everybody in my family is small and underweight for our ages. We always were. So then, you know, one nurse said, maybe it's just because he's a Tynan, you know, and all the Tynans are small and underweight. So I will always remember the first psychological assessment he has, because of the reaction of my parents afterwards. My mother cried for days. My parents were told when he was 3 that his level of difficulty was so significant that he would probably never ask a question because he wasn't really speaking much at that age, at the age of 3. And I remember thinking, wow, because Jarleth was still Jarleth. So people could make whatever judgments they wanted. But actually, Jarleth was this beautiful little boy. He was full of fun. He was so good with his social skills. He interacted so well with us as his family, but people outside of the family as well. And I remember feeling this huge weight of, the question of what's wrong with him. And of course, now when people say what's wrong, there's nothing wrong. There's absolutely nothing wrong. He is perfect. He has learning difficulties, but as human beings, we know this as we get older. We all have challenges in life. And in many ways, I think Jarleth is probably a much more balanced human being than many people that I know. So growing up with him was hugely influential because as a family, I think we learned to always support the underdog, the person who's not doing so well. We would be very supportive of minority groups. We have a sense of patience, I think, with people and a level of understanding that we mightn't have had if we didn't have Jarleth in our family. So it certainly influenced me becoming a primary school teacher. Jarleth had a wonderful support worker who used to come to our house every second Monday for about 2 years. And she would show my mother some resources to use with my brother, like a pegboard, for his fine motor skills. And my mother would show it to me. I remember I would rush home on a Monday to see if Mary had visited and what she had left. And I would do this with Jarleth every evening. I loved, trying to teach him things, and I loved seeing his progress. So it was very natural for me to become a primary school teacher. Now, what's interesting is Jarleth was 14 before we realised that his developmental delay was due to Williams syndrome, even though in this time he was enrolled in a special school in Ireland for people with a mild general learning difficulty. And when I found out that there was a name on his condition, it made me just want to find out more. And at the time, that was about 1997. So the internet was just coming into Ireland and it was only available in places like public libraries. And I remember going into the library with a cousin of mine who knew how to use computers effectively. And he showed me how to, whatever the term for Googling was back in the good old days. But he showed me how to find out about Williams syndrome in a search engine. And I will never forget the American document that came up that had 4 faces of people with Williams syndrome. And I went, wow, there was no question. So that, I suppose, led me to want to do research because I felt all the information we had in Ireland came from either the UK or it came from America, which is fantastic. But it's also important to have some information, particularly around facilities that we have in Ireland. So when it comes to education, we have a slightly different educational system to the UK and to the US. So having resources for our population in Ireland, I feel, is important. So that led me then to become very interested in research and particularly to create research that families can understand and that people themselves with Williams syndrome can understand.
I read on a website, I don't remember which one, that you snatched your brother from a school and schooled him yourself. Does it sound a bit like rebellion?
Yes. So this was interesting because at the time I was a primary school teacher at the time, okay? So I was maybe about 23, 24. And the Department of Education launched a pilot project where we introduced foreign languages into primary schools. And I had done French with my degree. So I had decided, with the permission of my principal, I was going to teach French to the 2 oldest classes in the school. And Jarleth was very good at languages. But because Jarleth was in a special school, it meant he didn't learn languages, which is an interesting situation also. So I used to collect him on a Wednesday from his school. So during my lunchtime, I'd drive into his school. It was about 2 miles from my school. I'd collect him and I'd bring him out to my school. So it meant that he had maybe 20 minutes of playing with the other children during lunchtime. And then he did French with my class for an hour. And then he did French with the other class that I taught. They weren't my base class, for half an hour. And it was a really interesting, what we called at the time, an integration project. So this was, in the mid 1990s. And we were very much, I suppose, looking at how can we include children with different needs in the mainstream class for short periods of time. I mean, it's so different to today, where children with special needs are in mainstream classes. And I did work with my own class, to teach them about being supportive and understanding and kind. But it was a fascinating time, because I could see Jarleth's limitations as a learner, and I could also see his strengths as a learner. And I could see in particular his impact on the typically developing children in my class. It really brought out the best in them. I remember at Christmas, some of the girls in the class making Christmas cards for Jarleth and giving them to me to send home. And they all gave a little bit of money together and they bought him a selection box, the different chocolate bars. They gave him that for Christmas. And for Valentine's Day, they would make him little cards and he'd leave them hidden in the classroom for him. They were really good. And it brought out the best in him. But for me, I had always had, I suppose, a sense of being maybe a little bit perturbed that Jarleth had been sent to a special school. I always wondered, was it the right decision? And when I taught him myself, I could understand my parents' reason for sending him to a special school. His level of need, I mean, he was great when he was doing things that he was interested in, but I could see how difficult it was when he wasn't being, I suppose, pushed individually in particular lessons. And certainly the school he went to really brought out the best in him. There's no doubt about that. But it makes me very happy when I see nowadays all the children that I work with who have Williams syndrome. So many of them go to mainstream schools. But it also makes me conscious of the parents who make that decision to send their child to a special school. It's a difficult decision. And parents make it based on the need they see in their child. And it's knowing what their child needs. And I think it can be very easy to judge, and say that child would be fine in a mainstream school. But actually, parents know their child best. And that was probably my biggest learning from having Jarleth in my class, was knowing, in fact, that he had learning difficulties that would be very difficult to have catered for at the time in a mainstream school.
Yeah, and so my plan was to ask you that question later, but now I think it fits. You give us if parents in the situation to decide to which school we should send it or give it. So I mean the German school system is different from the Irish too, but could you give some tips or some ideas from your rich experiences? What could what should parents think about, or what should be a reason to decide?
It's a brilliant question, and so many parents ask it. When I talk to a parent who has a newly diagnosed baby with Williams syndrome, invariably one of the first questions that parents ask me will be, where can my child go to school? And it's fascinating you can have a child as young as 9 months old or, a year and a half, and parents are already asking this question. I did a research project with parents in Ireland about how they chose their child's school. And the bottom line was parents had an idea from visiting the school if their child would be welcome. Okay, and that's, that says a lot about the educational system in Ireland, that a lot of it comes down to the teacher's attitude, particularly the principal, because they meet the parent first of all. So I would always advise parents to look at the schools around you and visit each of them as early as possible. So maybe when your child is 3 and they're going to start school at age 5, visit the different schools, special schools, mainstream schools that might have a special class attached to them, or mainstream schools. Some parents chose schools that had smaller pupil-teacher ratio, where they knew the child would only have maybe 20 other children in the classroom, because some classes in Ireland might have 30 children or more. Some children chose it due to where their friends, the child's friend was going after preschool, so that they would have a social group, in a sense, to protect them when they started primary school. So my advice is always get as much information as you can. If it's possible to get a psychological assessment, it can be very useful for a school to be able to plan for the child. And it's really important to talk to the teachers who will be teaching the child. Let them know about Williams syndrome. Let them know how it affects the child. But most importantly, give them an insight into your child as a person. What do they like? What are they good at? What do they respond to best when they're challenged? What makes them anxious? So there's a number of different, elements that teachers find very valuable that have nothing to do with the psychological assessment. So for me as a primary school teacher, I want to know the personality. What do I do if your child cries? Do they like a hug? Do they like to be left alone? Do they like you to rub their back? Do they like you to maybe start singing to them? What actually calms them down? When are they most likely to be challenged? Is it with sharing? Is it with, being able to just cope with frustration? Is it being, with toileting? And then I can be prepared for those times, and I'm not leaving the child, to be at risk of frustration. I can actually put in place different supports. Now, what I will say as well to parents is that if you have your own strategies, teachers are usually delighted to get them. And I certainly have found that when parents have given me strategies, I've been able to use them with typically developing children as well. So whatever we learn from Williams syndrome isn't just relevant for Williams syndrome. It tends to be, just really good inclusive practice. And as the child, I suppose, starts school also, it's important to book yourself in for regular meetings with the class teacher to just make sure that everything is going well and that the teacher has a chance to ask questions, but also that you as a parent have a chance to give feedback on what is your child like when they come in from school. If they come in and they're lying on the ground, crying and very upset, the chances are they're being probably forced too much to conform at school. And they have to regulate themselves too much. So you might need to talk to the teacher about that. If they come home very happy, the chances are school is working out really well.
Sounds logical.
Yeah, very logical. Exactly, yes.
Yeah, as far as I know, there's no scientifically robust data on the situations of children with Williams in the German school system. So I'm only talking about anecdotal stories that parents tell me or that are told to me. So there's a medical center for Williams syndrome patients in Germany, and families have the chance to go there, and they are always ask a range of questions about their life situation. And the head pediatrician told me that the school situation is often reported by parents as the biggest problem they have in daily life. And that surprised me, because there are a lot of medical problems, heart problems and all these things. Many parents say that they have had very good experiences with inclusive schools, but others say that the situation is disastrous, is awful. So you can say that in kindergarten it usually works well for the most, maybe not for all, and not for everyone, but for the most. And in primary schools, yes, with ups and downs, and there's a big break in secondary school. So at latest during the job training, so there are more and more steps and barriers. Many try to send their children to an inclusive kindergarten and then to a primary, mainstream or inclusive primary school. But at a certain point, they say, okay, that's it. I want inclusion, but I want a normal school nearby. But the way things are going for my child here is they're not going well.
Exactly.
Yes, many of them go to private schools, especially they send them to a Waldorf schools, and parents say, I have no links with anthroposophy or with Waldorf pedagogic or Steiner's philosophy, but I feel that my child is really welcome there in this kind of school.
We have that situation in Ireland also, where the child may be fine throughout primary school. Now, very often with each year, they can have more difficulties with maintaining the level of their class, and they struggle with some aspects of the curriculum. So we have a very high percentage of children with Williams syndrome in Ireland who might do inclusive schooling up to age 12, primary education. But then for post-primary education, we have a very unusual situation in Ireland where most children with any kind of special needs transfer to special schools for post-primary education. However, in Ireland, there is a large number of special classes attached to inclusive schools, but the vast majority of them are for people with autism. And of course, this means that children with Williams syndrome cannot enroll in those special classes. And a lot of them would probably do very well in those situations because they would be able to be part of mainstream classes for certain subject areas. But then they would have a base class where they can do basic literacy or numeracy or other areas where they can take certification. So the result is that many of the special schools in Ireland don't do certification. So when they leave school, it means that very often they are in adult centres. It's very much sheltered employment. And while there can be still a degree of teaching and learning in the adult centres, there's no real end goal in many cases. So we have a lot of people with Williams syndrome in Ireland who are adults, and they may only be working, a small number of hours each week, and the rest of the time they are in an adult centre where they're engaging in a variety of activities, but they are not being challenged to develop a wider range of skills. And I think that's a terrible pity because I see just such potential in people with Williams syndrome.
I agree with you. In Germany, we have been having a very moralizing and ideological debate about inclusion for quite some time now, based on the motto inclusion is good and special institutions are bad. And in my opinion, there's too little discussion about specific goals, so such as what is an inclusive community or a high level of participation for all might look like in concrete terms. So the truth or the reality is that mainstream schools, especially secondary schools, are not prepared to educate all children and young people with Williams syndrome, and teachers feel not or are not trained or feel not trained appropriately. And beyond this, we have a mainstream school system that in principle works in the same way as did, let's say, 100 years ago with marks and pressure-based system that sorts children.
There's huge pressure, yes.
Yeah, the special system with a kind of safe spaces was developed precisely because children and young people with disability were not accepted into the regular school system. Now these children have the right to go to a normal or to inclusive schools, and the idea of learning together is certainly the right one. But what has changed in regular schools that it can work.
Yes.
So basically everything has remained the same at the secondary level. So inclusion assistants are now supposed to manage the balancing act, and that can work or it can't work. And then the results in a lot of suffering for children with Williams and for families and for engaged teachers too. So I think there's too much pressure, and there's still a learning culture that is really different from what inclusion should be. So that's why it's definitely not easy for families to find the right decision where should they send their child, and that's why it shouldn't be discussed in such abstract terms, but rather by looking at the specific situation, at the real and concrete involved people there. As far as to the job training or is concerned, so in Germany we say Berufsausbildung. If the parents are strong and if they live in the right place, hopefully in the bigger towns, they have there the opportunity to place their child near this in Germany so-called first job market or labor market, or in the first job market. So we have very interesting alternatives here. For example, I had a podcast some months ago, an interview here with Caitlin. So she comes from Switzerland and is a professional theater actress. And it's very impressive to hear what she has to say. I also know someone with Williams who works for Lufthansa. But these jobs are rare, and you need a lot of support to get a job like this. So in Germany, historically, there's a long tradition of sheltered workshops, what we call Werkstätten für Menschen mit Behinderung. And in these workshops, or in the past, or individuals with intellectual disabilities usually went directly from special school to these Werkstätten. And I worked in one of these workshops for many years. And there are definitely many problems and frustration there, especially with regard to pay. But a general shutdown of the workshops, or taking the most able and leaving a group of the weakest behind, can't be a solution, which we call inclusion, so from my view. So we simply don't yet have alternatives for everyone who goes to that Werkstätten or workshops, especially the persons with complex needs. And yeah, all I want to say is that we shouldn't blame the Werkstätten for the way the labor market works. So namely, not in a way that makes it possible for everyone to participate in working life. And if the discussion is framed in such a way that the workshop or the Werkstätten and the special system are always blamed, so if they are devaluated, and within the staff who work there, and then you shoot yourself in the foot. And even for those who, for instance, only manage to find employment in the primary labor market for a certain period of time with the help of an assistant employment, so they returning to the Werkstätten remains as a safe option. So if it doesn't work, they have the option to go back. And even if it's for a year or two, and they can try again. So for many individuals, the Werkstätten is an important place where they meet other people, where they live and structure their life.
And at least, while it is not the ideal situation, at least they have some place to go every day. There's a reason to get up and get dressed, meet friends. And I think one of the challenges with adult services is that very often parents have been advocating for their child from a very young age. So by the time they get to adult services, parents have been advocating for their child for nearly 20 years. And I think this is a time, if there are siblings who are interested in supporting their brother or sister with Williams syndrome, it's a good time for them to get involved, to be able to maybe see what their sibling is doing in the workshop situation or in the adult service, and perhaps to give suggestions also to those workplaces on how their sibling can be supported or activities that maybe could be done. I just feel myself that very often parents are tired. They've lost a lot of energy by the time their child with learning needs has got to age 20. And I think very often they're grateful that there is a centre where their child can go during the day. So at least they're getting some degree of stimulation. But when we look philosophically at it, it's not enough. And, we are looking to create inclusive societies where everybody can reach their potential. And that's certainly the challenge in Ireland at the moment. There is certainly moves to create more options for adults who have experienced learning difficulties or any adults with disabilities. But funding is the issue, and there still is not enough funding being given to create a range of different, a variety in what is available. And again, a lot comes down to the type of disability group. That's the way it has emerged in Ireland. If you have autism, you tend to have far more facilities available. If you have Down syndrome, again, it's a wonderful, vibrant community in Ireland. There tends to be a lot of support for people with Down syndrome working in the community. They're very visible in Irish society. And I think it's about us being able, as, let's say, a Williams syndrome advocacy group, we need to be able to look at what other disability groups have done, and we need to be able to piggyback on what they are doing, follow the models that they have. But it takes a lot of people, and we don't tend to have that, enough people with Williams syndrome in Ireland or in Germany, in the world in general, to be able to make those big changes at government level. So I think we are many years away from being truly inclusive, even in primary school, in kindergartens. But I think there's progress. Every decade we are seeing more and more that there is a higher level of understanding. So I hope that in the next 50 years, there will be variety in adult services where people with Williams syndrome can actually have their needs met, but also feel fulfilled. And I certainly see that with Jarleth, because a number of years ago in his adult placement, they did packaging for a number of different goods. So one of them was shower gel. It was a range of cosmetics, that's the word, a range of cosmetics. And he was involved in the packaging of them. The businessman who was involved in that was fabulous. He never put them under pressure. I mean, Jarleth would not cope well under pressure. He was really good. And if they had high demands for a certain shipment, he wouldn't tell the people in Jarleth Centre that they were under pressure, but he would hire, more people to come in at night without learning needs who would catch up, for example. So they were never put under pressure. He had a Christmas party for them. They got a wage. They felt really useful. Jarleth would see some of those products in a shop and he would say, I packaged those. So there was a great sense of pride. And I think we need more of those community, I suppose, links where business and where various community initiatives can take on board people with Williams syndrome and other learning needs.
Now there's an abrupt change of subject, but perhaps it's not so abrupt after all, because it's also about pride in oneself. So you have launched another piece of jigsaw that can help create a more inclusive society by involving teenagers with Williams to create a new educational guideline for the school, but especially for the pupils, for students. So this project is called My Own Williams Learning. The first letters of these words spell owl, like the bird owl. It's a very surprising idea that you came up with. Could you tell us a little about how you came up with this idea? How did you find the young people, and how did you go about creating the guidelines?
I think it's always very interesting what happens in research. So I started off as a primary school teacher. So I suppose my mindset is, what is name one action I can do to support a child? I'm coming from a very practical perspective. And now that I'm involved in research, I'm not interested in high-level academic research that is only going to be published in papers that academics will read. I want it to be applied research that will benefit people with Williams syndrome and the people who love and care for them. So I had written the book WISHES, which stands for Williams Syndrome Holistic Educational Strategies, back in 2018. And On foot of that, Joe Van Hervegen contacted me from University College London to ask if we could do a joint project to update the educational guidelines for the Williams Syndrome Foundation in the UK. And she was very interested in that very practical approach also. So, just give strategies. Very often parents and teachers don't want sort of the scientific background to things. Teachers are very busy professionals. It's like, tell me what I can do and I'll do it. Parents want to be able to understand it in a way that they can support their child at home. So we interviewed parents and teachers and teaching assistants, and we involved a few children, but actually we found that there wasn't enough in what we had done with the children. We felt we needed to explore it much more. So I said to Joe, we should probably look at doing a completely separate project where we just talk to the children and let them tell us what they want. Because I think too often research is done on people with Williams syndrome rather than with or even by people with Williams syndrome. So a lot of the parents who had been involved in the initial research said their child would be interested. So everything was set up to be accommodating for the child with Williams syndrome. So we said anybody from the age of 4 to 18 who was in education, we would be delighted to talk to them, which we did. And it very often involved things like puppets. And we had focus groups, which was really good for them to hear other people's perspectives. Like very often my own experience is that a child...
I'm sorry, could you say what a focus group is?
Oh, a focus group is when you have 2 or more people in an interview. And, one person will say something and then it sometimes triggers somebody else to say something related to it. And it just becomes a very rich conversation. Whereas an interview, it's just one person asks the questions, one person gives the answers. So we gave the children the flexibility of being in a focus group discussion with other people with Williams syndrome or having an interview by themselves. And there was a couple of children who had an interview by themselves, and I gave them the option of talking to me or talking to a puppet. And I had a range of different puppets that they could talk to. And invariably, it was really interesting. The vast majority of them chose the unicorn hand puppet to talk to. They seemed to really like that. So I went off screen and basically the puppet of the unicorn talked to the child and kept the conversation going. Now, a couple of very interesting things about puppets actually in golf for parents who might be listening or teachers who might be listening. We know that children with Williams syndrome are very emotional. We know that they're very sensitive to the emotions of others, and we know that they spend a lot of time in an anxious state trying to read a person's face and figure out what mood are they in, what's going on for them. I have certainly found over the years that when I use puppets with people with Williams syndrome, the anxiety goes down because they don't have to read the puppet's face for emotion. So actually, they can hear the message much more clearly and they tend to engage at a much higher level. The other thing was that a lot of the children, when they heard I was going to use the puppet, they went to get a cuddly toy or a puppet themselves, which actually became a great sense of, sensory relief. So it really promoted self-regulation. So this can be something in a classroom also where the child could have some kind of a sensory toy. When I taught in kindergarten ages myself in Ireland, ages 4, 5 and 6, every child had to bring in a sock and they used it as a puppet in my class because it's good for participation, but it's also very good for sensory regulation. The children very often will rub the sock as they're when it's on their hand, and we get lovely calm children. So it's not just for children with Williams syndrome, but I do find it works a treat. So then with the interviews, we asked the children, what would you like your teachers to know about Williams syndrome? And what would you like your teachers to support you with? And how do you learn? And what we actually found was a number of things that were really interesting. The first thing was some of the impressions we have of Williams syndrome are dated. So we know that children with Williams syndrome have difficulty with fine motor skills, but actually so many of the children we interviewed really liked playing with Lego. And in the past, we would have said Lego is quite difficult for children with Williams syndrome, but actually a lot of children really enjoy playing with it. So we shouldn't set up barriers because we think, oh, fine motor skills are challenged, I'll make things easy. If the child is motivated to play with something like Lego, let them. It's wonderful. The other thing we learned is that, okay, while handwriting is a difficulty, children really enjoyed things like science. They really, the vast majority seem to really enjoy things like science and history in school. You know, again, I wouldn't have expected that so much. We tended to think that children liked the creative arts, but we didn't see them enjoying as many academic subjects, which actually we were incorrect about. So that was really good to see that there is a change. We have different parents now to the parents of 20 years ago. So naturally, there's a change in how children are learning when they have Williams syndrome. They're being motivated in different ways. Parents, I suppose, understand the condition better, and there's far more early intervention. So what we decided to do then was, again, this was based on what the children wanted. We wanted them to feel that, yeah, you're very good at certain aspects of learning. So we put together what we called the WOWs, the wonder of Williams. We're going, wow, which the children really liked because they were good at so many things. And we basically took, it was like the book that I had originally written, Wishes, which broke up how do we learn? And we can break it into 10 different components. You know, that to learn effectively, we don't go down the academic route. First of all, we look at the physical, the sensory, the social, the emotional, the behavioural, how the child participates and engages, what their life skills are like, what their creative skills are like, their sense of self-esteem and sense of belonging. And then the academics will fall into place. But there's a huge amount needed before a child can learn academically. And we can forget that. So we used those headings again because we felt for inclusive learning, this works well. And it's kind of the way the teachers and parents had talked to us as well. They tended to bring up elements of those. And we then came up with our list with the children about the things they were good with and where they fitted. We came up with then some of the issues that they're likely to have. And that gives a child, that should build their self-esteem. So it's not that, oh, I'm stupid. Oh, there's something wrong with me because I find it difficult to do handwriting. The idea is that if you have Williams syndrome, you probably will have some difficulties with these. So it's not you. It's because you have Williams syndrome. And while we don't use it as an excuse, it means that the child realizes that it is part of Williams syndrome. So they are the same as so many other children in the world who have Williams syndrome. And we call those
like
the POWs.
Josie and Joe.
Exactly, Joe and Josie. So the POWs then became the problems of Williams. Now, I don't really like the idea of problems, but the WOW and the POW works well from a child's perspective. So in the book, we had 3 characters. We had Dr. Owl, because of my own Williams learning. So Dr. Owl gives them the information. So what does it mean to have, what does it mean to do sensory learning? And then Joe and Joe, so we've got a boy and a girl, and they're at different levels or different stages of development. Now, there's a reason for that. Very often the parents were saying to us, well, what should my child be doing, at age 5? What should my child be doing at age 7? How can I support my child at age 15? And of course, the age doesn't matter. It's the stage of development. So what we tried to do was have that mix with Joe and Josie. Yes.
One question. What does it mean? Could you explain that? What's the difference
stages of development? Yeah. So for, let's say, a typically developing 5-year-old, they are likely to be able to sit in a seat and pay attention for up to 20 minutes. They are likely to be able to hold a pencil and make marks on a page, and do that for maybe 20 minutes also. They're likely to be able to talk, have a good vocabulary, and so on. So that's for a typically developing age. The problem then with Williams syndrome is that very often there's a developmental delay. So by you telling me that your child is age 5, I won't be able to tell you what you should do to support them. I need to know what can they do now? What is their stage of development? So very often a child with Williams syndrome will be, a year or a couple of years behind their peers, their typically developing peers. So we need to look at where are they at in their development. Now, this doesn't mean putting an age on it. Oh, my child is 5, but they're at the level of a 3-year-old. It's just looking at what can my child do now? and then we know how to move them on to the next level. So in the book, we don't talk about developmental levels or age levels. We give a range of challenges that a child with Williams syndrome might experience in school based on what the children told us. Then also based on what the children told us, we came up with what you can do to develop these skills. So some of the things that the children were already doing, we put into the book. And then so that it gave a sense of, I suppose, a sense of power to the child, that they could feel this sense of agency, that they can do something about their learning difficulties. They could select then one target. So for example, under physical development, they might say, actually, my handwriting isn't very good. I'd like to be better at handwriting. So then they might set a little target for themselves. I'd like to be able to write a birthday card to Granny that says, "Dear Granny, happy birthday, love, Fionnuala." Okay, that might be their goal. So all of their writing practice is not for being able to, fill in maths questions or history questions. The goal is to be able to write a birthday card for Granny. But I'm going to be practicing my writing skills when I do my history, when I do my maths, and so on. So the child then has a sense of empowerment. And what we're trying to do then is make those links to what the child will need, not just for learning in school, but for learning in every day.
How would you summarize the special nature of these educational guidelines? What are the core messages of MOWL in your view?
So the core philosophy was that it would come from the children themselves. So they chose the cover. We got a graphic designer, but they chose from the 3 different ones that were given. And then they made more changes afterwards, actually. They chose the name. It had only been, we were funded to create a digital resource, and the children were saying, "No, I want a book. I want a book for myself." So the Williams Syndrome Foundation were fabulous, and obviously they will do what their children need. So they publish the books then as well. They can be downloaded by anybody, but they send them out to the families if they want them. So it was very much child driven, which meant the process took quite a long time. So even when the book was done, we then sent a copy to each of the children that were involved for them to try it out and to see what worked and what didn't work. So basically, the children were the ones guiding the process. They were telling us what they wanted. Another key philosophical part of it was that it's strengths-based. We are very much saying that Williams syndrome is not so much a disability as, it's a learning profile. You'll be good at some things, you'll have difficulties with other things. A strong focus on self-esteem, that they can identify what they're good at themselves. There's all these little check boxes and so on. So it's a workbook. It's meant to be used by the child. So they can see, I'm good at these things. And even over time, they might find they weren't good at something to start with, and now they're good at it. So they can see a development themselves. The characters in it are supposed to be identifiable. So this is just, I suppose, it is so child-centered from beginning to end. And at the very end, there's a certificate as well for the children. So they have that sense of achievement. And it can be downloaded as many times, as the family or the school want, so that the child can be working on these things. But I think too often, we do research, and it would be so easy to just do a couple of research papers, academic research papers, to say what we learned about how children view their profile. But my God, it was just so powerful to create a book that the children can use themselves. And the feedback has been very, very positive. One mother made contact and she said that her child brought the book on holidays. And he didn't need help. He didn't want help. He wanted to do it himself, which was fantastic. So it's about being able, I suppose, that children see themselves in a book. And I think that's absolutely key. Now, I gave guidelines to the graphic designer. So while, to have, for example, the nose would be kind of, a little button nose, maybe a little bit higher up on the face, to create that long philtrum, the gap between the nose and the lip, big eyes, and a wide smile. So I'm hoping, I suppose, that they are representative of Williams syndrome without being caricatures of them. I think that's important. But I think we fulfilled all our goals in making it something that could be used by children and could positively impact on their learning in schools. That's really what we had in mind. And from the feedback, we seem to have achieved it, which makes it very worthwhile.
Oh, yes. Yeah, it's fantastic. It's really, really fantastic. It's a good idea. And it's, as you said, it's from the beginning and the whole process, with the children in the center of your ideas. So yeah, it's wonderful. Did you get any feedback from teachers or schools?
We have. It's funny. Jo is taking care of that part of it. She has the link, and she gets the feedback. And to be honest, I'm not really sure. I know in the Irish context, I've recommended it to teachers when I visit children with Williams syndrome at school. I do a lot of school visits, and some of them have been using it, and they found that it was really good in terms of giving the child a sense of control over their learning. They had said the big difference about using the book was that the child very often had targets set for them by parents and teachers, whereas now the child was saying, this is what I would like to be able to do. And they tended to reach the targets quicker because they were more motivated. So that's a really good thing. I think what some teachers have said as well is that there's a great sense of pride that the child has Williams syndrome. So on foot of having the book, there's this idea of, well, this is my own Williams learning. This is about me. And, I have friends with Williams syndrome, and it becomes a part of their identity. And if there's pride with that identity, they get that sense of belonging with the Williams community. And we do know from research that having a sense of belonging at school is massively important for academic achievement. In fact, we don't get strong academic achievement without a sense of belonging. So children with Williams syndrome mightn't necessarily feel that they belong in their school if there aren't good inclusive practices, or if they're being maybe laughed at by their peers. But when they do My Own Williams Learning, they are connected to a family of people with Williams syndrome, and it gives them a sense of belonging. And that's really important just for their confidence to learn.
And what did you personally learn, which isn't in the book, which we can't read? So, for example, was there anything you could use for your work as a lecturer at university?
Yes. So I teach student teachers, and one of the biggest learning for me was we have to be very careful, even as a family member for me with Jarleth, but even as teachers in a classroom, we have to be very careful that we think we know more than the child. So if a child has a learning difficulty, the child actually typically understands the nature of their difficulty. They mightn't articulate it because we don't ask the right questions. And that to me is the bottom line. We can get children to tell us so many things if we create an environment where we are open. If we use resources, for example, like puppets or, Play-Doh. I would sometimes use Play-Doh as well so that the child is engaged and engrossed. They don't feel the strong social pressure. But if we have difficulties with supporting a child, talking to the child will very often give us the answer. And it's not that children can't take part in research. The big thing for me is children can take part in research if the researcher is skilled enough. So I say this to the student teachers also. When you're doing research, if you're not getting answers from children, you aren't asking the right questions. The disability very often isn't the child. This is what I tell them all of the time. I think there's far more instances of teachers with disabilities than children, because teachers very often are blocked in their way of thinking. They don't have an open attitude. They don't see the possibilities. They don't see the strengths that the learner brings. So we have to be very careful about the assumptions. And I suppose I learned that about the Lego, that, children were playing with Lego, even though they have Williams syndrome. That is not something I would have recommended to parents in the past. And now I can see that if the child likes Lego, because many of their peers play with Lego, get them a box of Lego. And the same thing with liking science and history. Typically what I had learned in the past, this is going back maybe 10 years, children were liking things like, music at school and religion at school because there was a lot of singing in it. They sometimes like the physical lessons where they could, play at their own level. But they typically didn't like anything academic. Now we're finding that when there is differentiation in schools, when children are supported, they can really enjoy different academic areas. So I think, it comes down to the teacher at the end of the day. If we want children with Williams syndrome to be included in mainstream schools, if we want them to achieve, it comes down to the teacher. Is the teacher prepared mentally and physically? Is the teacher willing to take on board suggestions from a parent and communicate with the parent on a regular basis? And is the teacher willing to look at other ways of doing things? So that's what I teach my students. That was my greatest learning. And I suppose it's one thing I say to Jarleth all of the time, but really there are no limits. It's just about finding the way to take the next step forward.
Or the next step, or before, I don't know, is that students who become teacher need these spaces too. So they need the experiences too, and they need the place, and they need an academic environment where they can learn all this stuff.
And I think in golf we also need to have high expectations of teachers and of student teachers. We're very lucky in the college in which I work because I run the Williams Syndrome Summer School each July from the college. So some of the students volunteer. So they end up with a really wonderful understanding of, what will it be like in my classroom if I have a child with a diagnosed need that I've never heard of? First of all, I get to know the child. I find out about the condition. I talk to the parents. So it's very useful. I think it's wonderful for them to have that facility where they can actually, come on board. They are being supported in how they work with the children. And again, we take very much a strengths-based approach. There's a lot of music and drama, but we're still doing the handwriting. We're still doing the fine motor skills, the gross motor skills, the academic learning, but doing those in ways that are motivating for the child.
I'm sorry, I have a last question to that to that book. What is the difference in the profile between participation and engagement? How can we translate it correctly in German?
Okay, yes. Yeah. That's a really good question. They go hand in hand very much. So participation is when the child gets involved very often in the physicality of a group or a learning experience. Okay? So they can participate in the PE lesson, the physical education lesson, but they might be doing things completely wrong, but they are part of it. Okay, so participation is being part of. Engagement is where there is a level of learning because the child is motivated. Okay, so there's an intrinsic motivation. The child is saying, I want to do this, and they're looking to do it correctly, and they want to do it again and again. They will stay at it, and they will have prolonged concentration during that particular activity. So the participation is more physical and the engagement is more emotional.
Okay. I mean, thank you. If we put all this together, what you said about how teachers should be trained or how we should met people with Williams syndromes. Of course. I need to ask a question about research. What do you think, and in which way should we change the research on Williams syndrome, and which challenges do you currently see for the community who's doing Williams research?
So I think we need a lot more research on how children with Williams syndrome read, for example. Okay, like I have seen huge differences. Is there a way to teach children with Williams syndrome to read? We're not really sure. There are particular ways recommended for Down syndrome, for example. But again, in my experience, I think we need to build up a range of case studies and just see what works in that way. I think it would be wonderful to have an online reading school. I did that with adults before, and that worked really well to be able to see where the gaps were in their learning. But I'd love to see it with children so that as it's happening, what are the parts that are emerging and what are the parts that are being challenged, for example. I think we need a lot more research on looking at children in their classrooms and seeing that authentic context. I think, obviously, we get so much information from work that's done in labs, but they're not naturalistic settings. And children can perform very, very differently in a lab to in a natural setting. So I suppose I'm very much promoting the type of research that occurs in natural situations. I would be very interested in more research being carried out on the actual learning difficulties that children with Williams syndrome experience in the system, whether it's in Ireland, in the UK, in Germany, in the US, in Australia. It doesn't matter where the child is located, that there are certain difficulties like, for example, dealing with sensory overload, dealing with poor fine motor skills. And I think in many cases, it's about building up more and more information about the strategies that parents use. Because I think too often we can look at a need, and like as an educator, I can give you suggestions of what to do with your child. But most of the advice I give to parents is actually based on being Jarleth's sister, the things that worked for Jarleth. So I think, a lot of parents can give us the information on what to do educationally because they're living it every day. And I think that we need to put people with Williams syndrome at the centre of it. What do they want to be able to do? Where do they see as being the challenges? What would make their lives easier, either in the community, in school, or at home? I think that all of those very practical aspects, I'd like to see them researched.
Why does this happen so rarely? Why does it not so easy to do this kind of research? I think for many parents, research and academic life of the university is maybe far away, and they are probably asking themselves these questions now.
So from my point of view, I think one of the problems is funding. Now, everybody who does research will say that. I mean, if I could get a really big budget, it means I could get buyout, as we call it. I wouldn't have to do my lectures and I could spend my time visiting children with Williams syndrome in schools. As it is, I visit maybe 5 children a year in their schools. Okay, that's about as much time as I have. But it's easier for me to travel than it is for a parent to bring their child to Limerick to visit me. Okay. The summer school that we do for children with Williams syndrome is ideal for doing the research because we have them all together for a week, and my observations of seeing them together is a great opportunity for doing research. So I think we have to look at how can we make research manageable. Being online, talking to people online is a really, really good way of involving people who mightn't be able to travel. So, by doing online interviews or focus groups where you've got several people together online at the same time can work really well. So we can change, if you like, that challenge into, there's a strategy for it. And I think, I really do believe that there has been a move by parents saying, I'm not going to get involved in research because it doesn't impact on my child. People do this research and I don't hear from them again. I think that whenever we do research with a minority group like Williams syndrome, the Williams syndrome community have to get something back. There has to be something practical that will improve the lives, or at least the information we have for people with Williams syndrome and their families. So I think that applied part to research. It's challenging because it takes more time. But actually, in my experience, for any of the challenges we have with research, they can all be overcome.
And what about the ethical committees or questions?
Yes, well, I've had issues myself with ethical committees. I understand their function.
Maybe explain what does it mean?
Sure.
Ethical committees.
Exactly. So before a researcher does research, they have to apply to an ethics committee, usually in their own university, saying what it is they want to research, and they give all of the details of the research project. And then the ethics committee decide if that research will be approved or not. Now, in the application, you have to put in your rationale for doing the study. You have to look at who is involved. And if you have, in particular, vulnerable populations like people with Williams syndrome, well, then how are you going to mitigate against that vulnerability? How can you ensure that they understand what you're doing? How can they understand what you're going to do with the data? Do they understand things like, their names will be anonymized, that you will remain confidential about what they say, unless there's a child protection issue? And we have to look at the child protection issues also. If a child was to make a disclosure of abuse in any way, that has to be acted on. So how do we communicate all of these to a person, let's say with a reading age of maybe a 5 or a 6-year-old? So certainly for the ethics committee that I have to send in my applications to, I have to have a version of the letter that I will give to parents who are what we call gatekeepers. The parent will decide if their child will take part in the research. And then I have a letter for the child also. Now, I usually do 2 letters. I do one with very easy language, very short sentences, and it would also have lots of images in it. And then I have one for a person with Williams syndrome who doesn't have much of an intellectual delay, and they're able to read and understand quite well. Then we have to have consent forms that have to be signed. I prefer to do consent forms orally with the person with Williams syndrome so that they're not getting nervous about having to sign a page. So as part of the interview or the focus group, I get them to tell me orally, and I go through each of those points as well. We have to be aware then of the profile of Williams syndrome. So if we look at, for example, they are prone to anxiety and they are people pleasers, what can I do to prevent that? One of the strategies for me has been to use, let's say, puppets. So I put that into my ethics form also. The main thing that an ethics committee want is to ensure that you will do no harm, that a parent, a teacher, a person with Williams syndrome will not feel worse about themselves following the research that you're doing. And I think while that is 100% what we would all want as researchers, it's also about looking ahead to think, well, what will I do if a parent gets upset? What will I do if a parent blames themselves for their child's learning difficulty? So it's that idea of preempting difficulties you might have in advance. And it's interesting actually in golf because during the interviews that I did with some of the teenagers for my own Williams learning, that research, it was really interesting because one of the teenagers started to cry when she remembered how people were not nice to her at school. So we know with people with Williams syndrome, she started crying and then everybody in the group started crying. So it caused this, knock-on effect. Now, because, I understand Williams syndrome, obviously, from being a sister of Jarleth, but also in my ethics forum, I was prepared for this, knowing the profile of Williams syndrome. So if they get upset, my idea was that I would reassure them, but I wouldn't try and stop them from talking. Because actually, if we start panicking because you're crying, I'm going to make you get upset thinking, oh my God, I shouldn't be crying. So I didn't want to make them anxious, but I then started distracting them and I suggested we sing a song. So being able to use that, their high distractibility, we can use it to an advantage as well. But it's interesting how it did occur. But because it was in the ethics forum, I suppose I was prepared before each focus group or each interview that these things might happen. And then, of course, the protocol was also then to make contact with the parent. Now, the parents were present for those, for all of those. So the parents knew what was going on. But I also could follow up with the parent the following day again to make sure that the teenager was okay and to offer if she wanted to talk to me again or talk a little bit more about it, that, we could do that. So ethics is really important, but it can take a long time to get through the different parts of an ethical process. I just put in an ethics form myself, actually, in golf. I prepared it this time last year, and I just got ethical approval last week. But it's involving children with Williams syndrome, where it's a little bit like doing MOWL with them. They're going to come to Limerick and they're going to demonstrate a particular skill that they find difficult. But it's a skill that they want to learn. And because there's going to be video recordings and their parents will send me little WhatsApp videos to show how the child is progressing each week, obviously there's huge ethical concerns about that, if somebody was to hack into my phone, they would have access to, videos of children with Williams syndrome and so on. So you have to fulfill, how do you protect children in this way? So eventually I got it through, but it'll be a very exciting project, actually, when it's done. I'm very excited about it.
So this is your next research project?
Yes. This is my next research project. So it's looking at children with Williams syndrome and I suppose getting them to be participants in the action research themselves, to say, this is what I'd like to be able to do. This is causing me stress in my life. And already, like during the summer school, some of them picked what they want to do. There's one child who really gets upset when she loses a raffle or a race or a game, and she wants to learn to be able to self-regulate during those times at school. Another child wants to be better at handwriting, which I was surprised about, so the goals that they chose, they're really good goals, I'd have to say. So they will decide what they want to work on, and then they are going to be documenting what is working for them, but it's an emotional documentation as well. Today I'm really frustrated. I wasn't able to, or I didn't practice it at all this week. I didn't feel like it. So we end up with this record, so that if a child wants to learn this skill, they can have a look at, let's say, Molly's profile, and this will all be documented in a book. So Molly wanted to learn how to play the piano. This is what she had to do. On the way, she found these things difficult. This is what she said. This is how she overcame the difficulty. And this is Molly now. We've got a little video of Molly being able to play the piano, for example. Okay, so it's about a 6-month project. Maybe it might go on for a year. We'll see how the children get on with it. But it's strengths based. It's the child is at the center, and we are showing all the wows, all the wonders of Williams.
Yes. Wow. Is it, of course, you need to focus on a group. I'm a little bit surprised that you don't do research on adults, on older people, because your brother is now an adult. Is it, what is the reason for it? Or is there no reason?
There's no reason. I go between the research with children and the research for adults. Now, I have another, as part of this project is going to be over 5 years, actually. So when I finish with a group of children, I will work with a group of adults. Then I will go back to a group of children. So I will move it up along. And I suppose it will be that mix. It is challenging when you're, I suppose, looking at education across the lifespan, But at the moment, I suppose I'm most involved with children of primary school age. That's where I get most questions. That's where I get, I get a lot of questions from teachers. I have a lot of meetings with teachers where they're genuinely, I suppose, confused about the profile, or just not sure how far to push a child academically when they have Williams syndrome. So it's about being able to help them as well, so that I suppose I don't need to visit schools as often. Having a repertoire, if you like, of little videos, and this will be, we will make videos as well of, let's say, me showing the child how to do it, or a strategy to support the child that parents and teachers can access. It'll be in a little reservoir of resources. So that's the idea as well, so that I can then spread myself into other areas as time goes on.
Okay, you're wonderful. So my last question is, if you were given a suitcase full of millions, in which area would you put it? So maybe in research, or you're free to put it in other fields?
Yeah. Oh, I mean, if I had endless money, my dream, my wildest dream is to set up a centre for Williams syndrome, a physical space. So that would encompass, there's a research centre in Norway. I can't for the moment remember it, but it's for rare diseases, as it's called, and Williams syndrome will be one of those. But basically, it's a residential building where a family can come when their child has been diagnosed with any rare condition. So I'd love this for Williams syndrome. The parents can come, and we would have a range of professionals to work with the family, the child, the siblings, and the parents, and provide support for them, give them an idea of, the things that they can do to support their child, give them the information about Williams syndrome, have therapy available for them there at that centre also. I think that's an important part of dealing with having a child with a disability. Being able to, I suppose, accept it yourself is a huge part of being able to support your child. So I'd love a centre that has all of that: an OT, a physiotherapist, an OT being an occupational therapist, a physiotherapist, a speech and language therapist, myself as an educationalist, and a team of researchers. And that parents and families could come at different times during the year and different stages during their child's development. So they might come when their child is newly diagnosed. They might come again when their child is starting school. We would run courses for teachers. We would then get guidelines for psychologists, for occupational therapists, so that we would build up a huge reservoir of knowledge about working with people with Williams syndrome across the whole lifespan. I would love it. So if you have any money, Ingo, send it this way.
Yeah, let's collect it.
Yes, exactly. Sort of a GoFundMe. Yes.
Yeah, that the Scottish football team and the supporters, they made such a wonderful picture here in Germany. maybe we can have an Irish and Scottish and German football tournament, and we collect some millions. Maybe.
Exactly. That would be fabulous.
There's some over.
That would be fabulous.
So, Fionnuala, I really, really thank you for that fantastic and inspiring talk, which is always inspiring. If I can,
it's always great to talk to you, Ingolf, because we have such interesting conversations always, and you're such a wonderful advocate for Williams syndrome and the role that you have in Europe with bringing all of us researchers together as part of our iReach group. You know, it's such a brave thing to do, and it just shows your vision is so much bigger than your own research. And, you know, I applaud you for that. And I suppose to make sure your German family's aware of the work that you do, because it's remarkable. So on behalf of people with Williams syndrome, thank you for all the work you do.
Oh, thank you. Thank you so much. Yes, and hopefully one day we can see you in Villingen. So Villingen is a little bit like your paradise from the where people meet. There's a huge hotel, and on one weekend every third year in Germany is a German Williams Association. They organize a meeting there, and everybody said it's like when you're on a different planet, because everybody is so friendly and open-minded, and
it becomes Planet Williams.
Yes, Planet Williams, yes, and it's so fantastic. And I could imagine that they really would laugh if you would talk to the people there, and maybe they find an interpreter. Yes,
maybe yes.
Thank you so much, Fionnuala, and we keep in touch and hear you later.
Definitely, thank you so much, Ingolf.
Das war Mehr als freundlich, der Podcast zum Williams-Beuren-Syndrom mit Professor Ingolf Prosetzky. Wenn dir der Podcast gefällt oder du Fragen und Themenvorschläge hast, schreib eine Nachricht per Mail an podcast@w-b-s.de, poste auf Instagram oder schau dir weitere Infos zur Folge auf der Internetseite an.